Good morning. Welcome to The Plough. This is the second episode, and with me today I've got Peter Rykenberg from Process Partners. G'day, Peter.
Hey, Andrew.
We're going to be talking about the dairy industry, both the farming part of the dairy industry and the processes part. And the reason I brought Peter along is he has much more intimate knowledge than anyone I know in relation to the dairy industry. Peter by trade is an engineer and works as one of the owners of Process Partners. Peter, tell me a little bit about you and a little bit about Process Partners.
Sure, Andrew. So Process Partners started in 2008. I'll go back to the late 80s when I joined the dairy industry in New Zealand. So my background is an engineer specialising in food manufacturing, and coming from New Zealand, the dairy industry is quite dominant there. So my background is in dairy technology and dairy processing.
Yep.
Since 2008, Process Partners was established in Australia. We're an engineering group who focus on planning, building and optimising food manufacturing. So we're a specialist food manufacturing engineering group, and the dairy industry being a large industry in food manufacturing.
And that's where we met each other, wasn't it? In the Murray Goulburn days. Yeah. So what Peter and I want to talk about today, and we'll probably go to our first slide actually, is really why has it changed? Why is it so dramatic, the change, the farming end and the processing end? But I think for us, where I'd like to start is to say the farming industry is misunderstood by many Australians who are not in farms. Most people think what we produce in Australia is used in Australia, and that's just not true.
Yeah.
And what that means is that the part that's not used in Australia but is purchased elsewhere is subject to huge volatility based on the global market. And of course, it is a much more competitive market than exists in Australia. And part of the Asian focus of change of that is a very strong change in the supply chain where the end users want to know each part of that supply chain and they want to have a relationship with farmers.
Yes.
And that's not just for controlling supply, but it's actually a personal relationship. It's a critical part.
Yes.
So for the first time ever, farmers are in a position to actually define their future. Yeah. Would you agree?
Yes.
But they're not doing it, are they?
No, and it is a major change, and that it's broad across food that people want that connection to source. They want that connection with the quality and knowing.
So it's like me when I go out and say, "Are they Coffin Bay oysters?" You know,
yeah,
because there is that depth of connection and love for a particular product. Yeah. So when we're talking about what's happening with farms, I've got a bit of data. You're ahead of data. Here I'm one who makes up a bit. You actually know it, but we've lost around about I think around about 60% of farmers in the last 25 years, dairy farmers. In the last 12 months, about an 8% drop. But the actual drop in supply has only been 25%. What's all that about, Peter?
Yeah, so it's a major concentration. Again, when you look not on that short term, but the longer term, you'll see it is a long-term trend that we've seen a consolidation of small farms into larger farms. Essentially, as you say, Andrew, it's a drop in number of farms, but not the same corresponding drop in volumes. So we've actually seen this drive for size and a drive for efficiency based on scale.
And it's hard, isn't it? Because, you know, dairy farming is one of the only exclusive farming styles in a sense that you just do dairy farming. So you're completely exposed to drought. You're completely exposed to changes in price. You're not doing anything else to create a risk barrier around you. You're stuck with what you got. So if you're small, something changes, you're dead, aren't you?
Yeah, there's not a lot of leeway there.
And in the 2000s, of course, a lot of the farmers were older. These are older people, weren't they?
Yeah, so if you go back to that time when you talk about this, 60% more farms, the average age then was 55 for the farmer. And so in that intervening 20-year period, a lot of those farmers are no longer in the industry, they've retired.
Yeah. So look, I think the dairy farmers, and I know a few for the same reasons you do, is it's incredibly hard work on a small farm. You are it. So there is no escape. You wake up early in the morning, you're working all day, and it's endless, repetitive, hard work. And there is no economy of scale. You are the only resource, which is not capital. You and your dog, I should say, are the only resource that are not hard capital, and you have no capacity to invest in capital. Yeah. So one of the major changes that's coming, I guess, why it's hard work is we need to see this move away from smaller farms because you're so terribly exposed, aren't you?
Yeah, so that family business model around a family farm, you now see a lot more what we would call corporate farms or farms where it's not an individual or an individual family.
All right. I think when you and I chatted beforehand, the challenge that nearly all farmers have, particularly in the northern part of Victoria, but also up further north again, is constant supply of good water.
Yeah.
That seems to be the major difficulty. And when we see where the concentration of farm failures are, it's north of
the dividing range.
North of the dividing range.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't we have a bit of a look now at our next slide? And I think this is probably where we start to see things really unravel, don't we, Peter?
Yeah.
We've got sort of three major issues here, and maybe if I can go through them one at a time. The first one we have is what's called deregulation. There's sort of two parts of deregulation. There was the state's capacity to compete with each other, which up until the early 2000s wasn't available. So cheap Victorian milk went north. And that really took out the price point that existed in the north. So that's been a dramatic change, hasn't it, for northern?
Yeah, exactly, because there was this price disparity with regulation where a Victorian farmer would be paid less for a litre of milk than a New South Wales or a Queensland farmer.
Yep.
So the New South Wales, Queensland farmers are a little bit upset because they actually are now competing across a national level for milk, not simply within a state. So it changes the return. So you'll hear a lot of negative discussion around deregulation, and it tends to be farmers from New South Wales or Queensland, because it's not the case in Victoria. Victoria has, for some period of time, Victoria and Tasmania is 2/3 of the milk supply in Australia, and that's where the bulk of the processing is done.
All right. Now, of course, there were other issues that existed which have placed enormous pressure, and that is the removal of a lot of tariffs. So when we look at milk, only about 30% of domestic milk production goes to milk, doesn't it? It actually then goes into actually particular commodities like the cheeses and dried powders, infant formula and the like.
So it's also another change over that. If you look over that longer time horizon, where, as you said, Andrew, now 30% of the milk produced goes into liquid milk. That hasn't been the case in history.
Yeah.
In history, it was a far lower proportion of the overall milk. If you go right back, it was closer to 10, 15%. So it's more significant now, but it wasn't in the past. In the past, it was milk for processing, milk going into commodity products.
And this is part of the difficulty, isn't it? And that is, as tariffs and subsidies disappear, then two things could happen. One is we were competing on a global scale for a domestic market.
Yes.
And our commodities, to be candid, were not as competitive as cheaper places like China, South America, particularly New Zealand.
Yes.
And so we've got a problem where we've increased the supply of milk that we're actually using for domestic use there, but we've hit this terrible competitive bump around milk commodities like the cheese and things because they're coming from elsewhere in the world. And there's different qualities, there's got enormous product differentiation, and they're often cheaper.
Yeah. Again, a good example to look at New Zealand because it's similar, we have a similar market.
Yeah.
Whereas they have a much smaller domestic market. So their real focus is commodity and export.
Yeah.
And over the same time period that we're talking, New Zealand's grown its milk production and they've scaled up and they do have an efficiency of scale, whereas Australia has not scaled up at the same rate. We don't have that same efficiency of scale.
No. And look, part of that is because where we are efficient is in the areas where we should be having cows and having milk. But Australia has a history of farming in marginalised lands that is heavily water dependent.
Yeah.
And in those places, it's very hard to get the scale, isn't it? Because you're not getting the quality of product either.
Particularly if you can't rely on that water supply, if it's consistent, reliable. But again, I think when we've come through major drought, and then farmers going, well, is that reliable? And the government's actually bought back water rights. So there's actually water, a farmer can sell the water rights.
Yeah.
So, and that's happened over that same period. So there's actually less water going into the dairy industry now than what it was going back 10 years ago.
Well, look, also let's talk about the other issue, which is the growth of China in dairy. I think the figures are by the amount we've dropped in our production over the last 20 years, they've grown in that level of production.
Yeah, and I think it's even over the last 6 years, China's increased its milk production at the same level of the scale of the entire Australian dairy industry in the last 6 years.
That's pretty scary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were our major customer.
Yeah.
In reality, we were historically exporting to Europe, but in the last 20 years, our major market's been Asia.
And that's also been our premium market. That's where we
Yes.
get our highest return. And it's in things like infant formula where we've got a decrease in the amount of children being born in China.
Yeah, and something like a 14% drop in the infant formula market in China.
So for farmers, I think from this, there's some pretty obvious answers, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is where you have great capacity to have solid, safe climate and you have sufficient volume around you, and you can start this change that we'll talk about a bit later towards connecting and making sure that you and the processor are aligned to where the end product is, there are enormous opportunities. But staying small, staying within a family has inherent risks, doesn't it?
Yes, it's inherently risky.
And look, can I just go back to dollar milk? Because I think that's one great story we should tell now.
And a very misunderstood story.
Yeah, when I was told about dollar milk, I thought, terrible supermarkets. But what's the truth?
Well, what happened in that dollar a litre milk change, and I talked to this on the background that process partners actually were engaged in this process, doing the modelling around it, the cost modelling around this. So that's our background in terms of that change. But looking at that change, it's a fundamental change where the supermarkets engage through the supply chain. So now the supermarkets are directly contracting farmers. So it's a real supply chain change.
Yeah, so what they do is they say, processor, this is your price for processing.
Yeah.
Farmer, this is, and the farmers are presently better off. It's the highest price at the moment.
Yeah, so where we sit at the moment, farm gate prices are the highest they've been.
Okay.
Because there's a shortage in supply.
So it's interesting. We can see that disruption domestically, but we're not seeing it internationally, are we?
Yeah.
And that's the international thing. When someone wants a commodity, a particular commodity or product, sorry, I won't mix them up, a product, it wants to connect right through the supply chain to farm gate and say, you're ours. And then this is the quality we need you to produce to achieve what we need at the end.
Yeah. Yes, and coming back to the dollar a litre milk, it's that rationalisation and that connection in the supply chain is a change in the market.
Okay. Look, let's go over to our next slide, because I think this is a fascinating part, because we'll now deal more with processes, okay? And we've seen unquestionably a reduction in processes, and we've seen the lack of centrality of processes for calling the game. In our day, the Murray-Goulburn days, where they fixed the milk price, they had the biggest voice.
Yeah, and 20 years ago, we were dominated by co-ops.
Yeah.
But it's, Murray-Goulburn, Bonlac, Bega were a co-op, Warrnambool Cheese and Butter, they were all co-ops.
And the difficulty is they created mediocrity. So they built Taj Mahals, beautiful plants, which produced something that was necessary for that market at that time, but were completely inflexible to the changes in the market and the future of globalisation.
Yeah,
is that a bit tough?
That is quite tough, but I think the reality is that the market's changed, the requirements of the products we're producing and haven't aligned to the change in the market.
And those cooperatives did no product differentiation in any real sense. They produced squares, blocks of stuff, and that's what they produced. They really just produced, in a global sense, commodity, rather than true differentiated product of any real sense.
Not consumer product that you buy in the supermarket. So it's a commodity that someone else is processing overseas.
Yeah. And what that's done is that, if we can just come back to the farmers for a second, it's made the farmers haven't thought, well, they can be part of producing a product. They can choose to be part of differentiation by changing herd stock to make sure that they're delivering a different product. So they can be in the fast lane if they want to be, but if they stay in the slow lane, they can only produce commodity, and commodity is at risk now.
Yeah, and that's where we do see this work between, I'd say, the producing farmers and processing, where we do see differentiation from farm. Specific examples being A2 milk or organic milk, where it's differentiated on farm, and then the processor then differentiates it through the whole supply chain.
Isn't this part of the process where, although you've got a single-use farm, you can actually spread your risk a little bit by having several types of herd to produce different types of milk to get the product that you want to get. So you've got a bit of risk protection that sits within it. But for a young dairy farmer now, you're looking at some form of consolidation, you're looking at some form of differentiation in product, and you're looking at a relationship where you actually have a lever in it. You're not just dependent on handing it over to a processor. Because when we look at our processes, we've really got two major problems, don't we? And that is we now manufacture into a global market.
Yes.
And most of what we do goes into a global market, and in many ways we're nowhere near as competitive as our three major competitors, which are China, South America, and New Zealand.
Yeah, and with the drop in volume, we've got an increased volume and proportionately increase in domestic supply, because we do have a bigger population. So actually between export and domestic, it's sort of 50-50 now. So actually the difference in the domestic market is stable. It's far more stable. So I think going forward, we see less fluctuation in farm gate return, because the domestic market has a higher proportion.
Yes.
But we are quite exposed to the export market, as you say, Andrew. So again, that connection becomes quite important.
And the second part of this is we've got some very aged assets that
Yeah.
evolved from that when they built those beautiful stainless steel kingdoms that they did from the cooperative, that a lot of the assets aren't designed for new product development, and there's too many of them, and they're aged.
Yes, because a lot of those assets went in the the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. They're 20-year-old, 30-year-old assets, and again, they were designed around making a commodity undifferentiated product that's maybe not where the market is today. So it's quite a capital investment to make that structural change.
And so what's happened with the process? We've seen quite a reduction, haven't we? We're starting to see that consolidation.
Consolidation in the number of manufacturers, but also in the manufacturing sites. Again, so that we have, instead of a lot of small sites, consolidating into larger, more efficient processing sites.
And what's the capex like in those larger sites? Are they starting to invest in new capital to productise rather than commoditise?
Well, where we sit now in the market, the differential between what the processor is paying the farmer and what the processor is getting paid, the processor doesn't have capital. There's no space there where we sit today.
So it's going to be a bit like a Coles and Woolworths thing. It is going to be the ultimate developer of product who's going to drive the change.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's fascinating, isn't it? All right. Perhaps if we head down to what are the opportunities, okay? Because I think that's probably where we should finish, shouldn't we? Looking at what you've said to me, if I can just summarise, and then let's really drill down into it. For farmers, these are the things. One, you are now in a market where you do have control over where your milk lands and the value of that milk based on the nature of the cow that you bring to it. What is the product? What is the end product use of that? So that's something you have. Secondly, you can't invest in the capital you need and the human capital you need to produce the milk cheaply unless you have significant size.
Yeah, you need to have some sort of scale. Yes.
Yeah. And the third part of that seems to me is it's inherently dangerous to be running a dairy farm in a place which has an unreliable water source like the Murray at the moment. I mean, I think we've seen what's politically happening up in the Murray is awful, and that's not going to be cleared up for another 20 or 30 years, I suspect. So in areas where irrigation is God and you're investing in long-term capital, not the place I'd have a dairy farm. That's my feeling. Peter, has that captured what you think is ahead for farmers, and what else do you think is important for them?
I think you have, captured those key points. And again, I don't underestimate that idea of connection between farm and end user, because that's the value. That's the value. Because people perceive a value in Australian products. They perceive a quality. They perceive, Australian cows eat grass, or you're in a clean environment. That's not the case for a lot of our customers.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the grain area. This is alive, isn't it? There are a number of people who are grain farmers who have deliberate and direct conversations with buyers in Asia for particular products because they are selling Australian crops.
Yeah. So in those markets, your product gets a premium, 20-30% premium, because of that perception of value of quality and that connection back to farm. It's a real premium.
Yeah, and I think so. I guess that's the thing that I wanted to say to farmers is it seems like doom. When you look at the raw numbers, it seems like doom. But actually, I think there's an incredible opportunity for dairy farmers who are willing to engage directly with Asian product developers to build those relationships, because the Coles and Woolworths thing is here to stay, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The processors are going to be less relevant. They are simply going to be people who make the commodity to go to someone But if they can brand it with your name,
Hmm.
then you get this 20% uplift and you're off to a better market.
Yeah. And there is a bit of Coles and Woolies bashing that goes on, but I think, to be fair to them, they have significantly rationalised their supply chains. So more of what you pay in that bottle of milk goes to the farmer proportionally than what it did in the past.
Yeah.
That they've been quite active in driving that.
So farmers 20 years ago were powerless.
Yeah.
They had a major processor nearby who determined milk prices.
Yeah.
Came and collected it. That was it. You just worked on your farm. Whereas now farms are a genuine business.
Yeah.
And if you can think of a farm as something that's actually selling a product that is wanted, you also develop sustainability, because by building those relationships, say in Asia, you will then get forward contracts for 2 to 3 years of providing milk at a higher return value, which takes away the risk that you currently have, which is based on the globalization of prices and the day-to-day fluctuation of milk price.
Yeah.
So building a business as a farmer which looks export is without doubt the best way of doing it, isn't it?
Yes, in the long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scary in the short term.
It's scary in the short term.
Okay. Let's switch over to processes, because as we've said, what are the future of process? That's the area that you and I work in much more.
Yes.
I work in farms in relation to debt. I work in relation to safety and a lot of other issues. But large manufacturing or processing businesses have historically been my trade.
Yes.
They've changed so dramatically in front of my eyes in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing is they're stuck.
Yeah, I think they're stuck. Again, they're dealing in margins that aren't there at the moment.
Yeah.
But there is a structural change required. We have assets that are underutilised. So I think this will still play out over the next 5 or 10 years, where you'll see news stories around closures and rationalisations. That will still play out, because we have to get to a point where we can efficiently process and produce products at a competitive price, and we're not there today in the industry.
And they have to look at themselves and go, okay, we used to be a commodity developer.
Yeah.
That strategy's half working.
Yeah.
It's not fully working. And so their strategies have to look at product development or engagement with product developments.
And also look at who the processors are today. They're predominantly not Australian businesses.
Yeah.
They're predominantly overseas businesses. So I think, again, this structural change requires quite a lot of investment, and it's probably overseas investment. And we do have some reluctance, let's say, at a government level around how you manage that. But we need.
But the volume of investment that's necessary to actually uplift the capital to deliver the products that are necessary to make farmers better off, we don't have the capital internally to do that. Nor the skill, to be candid with you.
Yeah, I think we've lost that, because we're going back to where we were maybe in the 80s and 90s, when that investment happened and we put the structure of the industry. Again, it's a cycle. 30 years later, we need to come back and look at the strategy and where's the investment now need to be. It's investment at the end of the day.
And I think, look, in the last couple of minutes, it's very difficult to get a government to look sensibly at agriculture. Part of that is the historical preserve of agriculture sits in the National Party and the back end of the Liberal Party. The Labor Party is seen to be the antithesis of that. But the truth is they don't have a true voice, because a true voice would have said a long time ago, the dairy industry could be one of our strongest. It's our third largest export of agriculture.
Yes.
So
it's large in manufacturing. It employs a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's a big manufacturing industry.
So the lack of strategy that sits in government around this is a bit daunting.
Yes. Because
you and I'm a lay person, you're a highly skilled person, but it's not hard to see where farmers can benefit.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see how processes, but it's the intervening government strategy about us going to market as a product deliverer to Asia of a clean green product, and trying to metamorphise our manufacturing and product design and say, no, get behind this. Let's start creating truly Australian cheeses that are highly recognised. Let's do these things. Let's not get stuck on the back end of infant formula and feel that was a great idea, which has faded 5 or 10 years ago. We seem to be, in government terms, 15 years behind the curve of where we need to be. Yeah,
and what you've described is somewhat how the New Zealand government got involved, what you've described. And actually you'll see a change. Again, I think, as that's supported at even the government level, helps that change process.
It's got to, doesn't it? Because if the government says, look, we want to have New Zealand products, we want to be proud of those, we want to actually brand something that is peculiar to New Zealand and a product and make it different.
We want to be connected to the supply chains. We want to encourage the investment,
Yeah.
all of those things.
Yeah, we just don't seem to have it. You know, if you go to work in New Zealand and in Singapore and set up a business, the government will get in behind you and look at how to support you in tax and infrastructure. It actually physically gets involved in making Singapore successful.
You'll see that in Queensland at the moment. The politics. We see investment right now in Queensland in food manufacturing that's being really driven, I think, by the Queensland government really dropping the shoulder and behind it.
Yeah.
So we do see that at the moment. Not so much in dairy, but generally in food, yes.
Yeah. So look, I think there's a bit of a call out to government, who I suspect aren't listening to us today, by the way, but if you are, Andrew, Peter.
But it does play out when you're looking at these long-term changes.
And I think for the farmers, you've got to understand advocacy is not political, it's product.
Yeah.
Because politics has let you down on the farms forever. So where farmers need to drive is towards how do we create wealth and product development, and how can we be part of that? And I'm afraid the politicians don't get or aren't interested in it at a federal level.
Yeah.
This is really about elevating what an extraordinary industry you are, and then trying to get those points of differentiation down on the ground level for you, so that you can participate. Peter, it's lovely to catch up. Lovely to we could go on for this for a long time, couldn't we? And Peter's got charts, he's got everything here, but I won't let him show them. But great to have you along. Thank you for coming along. Thumbs up if you like it, and we'll speak to you soon. Cheers.